I'm going to give you something of a background to the context for the research circles, and I'm conscious some of you may well have heard this before, so apologies to those of you who have. But Ian's going to add 2 or 3 slides at the end, just quickly, just to set the scene. So just to tell you something about the context of the research circles and the events for this year. They do come from a series of events which took place between 2019 and 2023. Many of you will be aware that we had a Centenary Commission which was looking at the historic 1919 Adult Education Report and was actually seeking to create a Centenary Commission report for the 100th year centenary from the original publication. So a number of us were part of that Centenary Commission, myself included, but with my other hat on as chair of the Raymond Williams Foundation. The Centenary Commission work took place during 2018 and primarily in 2019, and we then created Centenary Commission report, which many of you will have seen. There were a number of key focus areas in the Centenary Commission report. And the one that seems to have grabbed people's attention and interest most was the one around fostering community democracy and dialogue. So since actually 2020, from around September onwards, we've had a research circle. There's a group of 8 to 10 of us who come together fairly regularly to develop ideas for this research circle. And as a consequence of that, we've created a series of events which have taken place, all online, initially through the pandemic, of course, and consequently, and we've continued with the online focus because we do recognise that it gives us this tremendous diversity of people who are able to attend, and it's really enabled us to have a much more, if you like, international profile and international attendees, which is quite wonderful. So our first 3 series of events took place in 2021, and we particularly looked in that series at what we called Resources for a Journey of Hope, using Raymond Williams' famous phrase, particularly seeking to focus on adult education, especially at community level, community activists, and we'll say something more about that in a moment. The second series last year looked at democracies in crisis. And again, I'll speak to that, and Ian will speak to particularly to this year's events. So just taking us through our first series of events in 2021. So this was a range of contributions, some fantastic contributions, all of which, interestingly, were recorded if anyone has an interest in seeing those videos. Of the discussions and particularly the presentations from people from across the country, different communities. And we were really seeking to look at how and why adult lifelong education is so very important, and also perhaps needed to be, we felt, radically reshaped in the COVID era. We also were very interested in how adult education relates to and fosters that democratic focus that we felt was starting to slide, particularly in England. So we were looking at particularly expansive forms of adult lifelong education rather than the more narrow definitions that many of us are unfortunately very familiar with increasingly. Our second series of events in 2022 took us further, if you like, into issues around democracy, particularly focusing on democracies in crisis, and really looking to debate different approaches and context for community adult lifelong education. So we sought in those events to look at where adult education was in relation to particularly issues around health inequality and the role of community-based adult education. Then we had an event in June which looked at ecological and climate emergency and the need for environmental action and ecological learning, in effect. And finally, our last event last year was around social responsibility and the role of universities, which is a pretty contested area in radical public engagement. All of these events were very successful. They've all been written up in some form or another. And I'm going to hand over to Ian to talk us through this year's events. Thank you, Ian.
Thanks, Sharon. I mean, I think, again, for context, what has been interesting is we ourselves, as a group of approximately half a dozen of us, have met regularly through each of the years to reflect on what we've been doing and plan our events. And one of the things that we've been really debating and going back and forth is about the interrelationship between the content, Sharon giving the examples from 2022, and the form in which we explore these themes. And so we, for example, from 21 to 22, we kind of took that, what you saw earlier, that thematic approach. And what we're seeing both in the event in April and the event today is we've consciously opened up space in the events so that we're balancing out a mixture, moving back and forth between presentations and dialogue and discussion. So that's been a kind of a conscious decision that we've made, and certainly in the event that we had in April, which was taking as a starting point the whole notion of learning cities. The discussions and the dialogues that we had there were very productive. So that's something about the form that we've designed and why we've designed the approach we have. We've got today's event, and then we have a third event in October. We will be sending you the details around on that. What I've just added on the next slide, that Sharon and I were discussing this ourselves earlier, was to just try and then briefly say and stand back from what we've just shared with you, is a sense, as a group, we've developed a chronology of events. What those events have done is that they've combined very specific examples of local practices in different parts, both of the UK and elsewhere. And I can think back to presentations about practices in Canada, is one example in mind. But so that the interrelationship between the local, the national and the international is another feature. And in terms of those generative themes that have emerged, and this is a kind of in a sense, an emerging personal reflection, is that what we had in April was something about those tensions between a managed sense of practices around lifelong learning and lifelong education. And learning cities may be an example of that, but also those kind of messy, marginal, possibly marginal activities, but are absolutely opening up spaces for expansive forms of lifelong education. And I think we saw that not just in discussions in April, but I can think back to examples of work that the WA were doing in Yorkshire, working with asylum seekers and refugees, and those very particular grounded examples for us relate to those wider themes, and those wider themes are ones that we're going to be exploring today. So this idea of us working in dialogue has been a conscious decision as to how we're designing this year's series of events. And what we've got here then is a summary that Sharon is now going to just take us through in terms of how we've decided both in April and today to kind of organise the events.
Thank you very much, Ian. So yeah, just very quickly. So obviously the events being recorded, the dialogue elements in particular. We will be sharing email addresses so that people have access to perhaps other contacts on the list as well, with your agreement. There will be today 2 dialogues followed by 30-minute discussion groups, and will be broken into breakout rooms as we've done in the past. And then at the end of each discussion group, this would be fantastic if you could do perhaps one thing, which would be to put a brief reaction or response to the dialogues from following your discussion group into the chat. That way, I've got access to that, and I can bring those comments and suggestions forward to the final session, which will be a 20-minute plenary where we get to reflect on the dialogue. We look at the themes that are emerging, and we start to be able to think about what next.